Gross domestic product. GDP is, or gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services that are produced in one particular nation or economy in that calendar year. It has to be within that calendar year, and it has to measure the total or the final product. It can't be a product that's in between stages, and we'll talk more about that. So GDP is important because we talked about supply and demand last couple weeks ago. We talked about the demand for the market for hats or BMWs or whatever. But now when we talk about GDP, we're looking at the aggregate or total spending, total income, and total output in an economy. This particular graphic is, I think at this point, a couple years old, but it represents just how large the U.S. economy truly is. So you see all of the 50 states have a label of a different nation or a different economy other than the name of their state. So for example, where you see Texas is labeled as Canada, what that means is that at one point in time, Texas had an equivalent gross domestic product all by itself, just the state of Texas, to that of the economy of Canada. Just to give you an idea of how large and how productive the U.S. economy has been. So what are things that are counted or not counted in GDP? GDP counts all final domestic or at home in the United States production for which there is a market transaction in that year. There are such things as non-market transactions. Used and intermediate goods are not counted in order to avoid double counting. So last year Mr. Strunk and I bought a used car. That was not, the sale of that car was not counted in GDP for last year because it was not a 2014 model car. The income the used car salesman earned from selling us that car, that was a service that was provided, that was counted in GDP. But if GM orders, I don't know, 10 million windshields to be put in their Yukons or whatever other GM car you want to think about, those are not counted. The sale of the windshields from the glass company to GM is not counted in GDP because when GM finishes producing all of those vehicles, the final price tag of that car will most definitely include the cost of that windshield. And so in order to avoid counting the value of those windshields twice, the windshields, when they're sold from one corporation to another, they're considered to be intermediate goods. Non-market production is also not counted. So when I hire a babysitter and I pay the babysitter in cash to watch my kids so Mr. Strunk and I can go out to dinner, that's a non-market transaction. Non-market does not mean bad, it just means it's not part of the marketplace that can be counted. Most non-market transactions or production involve cash transactions. It's very hard to track cash. Underground or black market or illegal activity is also not counted in the GDP. So we're going to look at several examples and determine which of the following are counted or not counted in the U.S. GDP and why. New U.S. manufactured Goodyear's tires are sold to General Motors Corporation. This is not counted. This transaction is not counted because these are intermediate goods. The value of those tires will be accounted for in the final sales tag or price tag of the finished GM car. A new U.S. manufactured Goodyear tire sold to me is counted because it's a final product. I'm not going to use that tire to try to sell or buy anything else. I'm just going to put it on my car and drive. Child care services provided by a babysitter for my kids, also not counted because it's considered a non-market transaction. A new Airbus A380, I made that number up, and an Airbus is a two-story plane. It's a very, very large aircraft. That would be counted in GDP. A new Boeing 787, which is also a large, usually commercial plane, would be counted in GDP. A new Toyota Tundra pickup truck manufactured in San Antonio by a Japanese firm, Toyota, is counted in GDP because it's produced in the United States. Aggregate spending, or the expenditure approach to GDP, is the formula that we use to calculate the value of our nation's gross domestic product. It's D plus I sub G plus X sub N, which means GDP is calculated by adding consumption, gross private investment, government spending, and net exports together. And net exports are exports minus imports, because exports and imports create money flows. Exports create a money flow into the economy that is exporting those goods because the goods are going out, the money's coming in. Imports create a money flow out of that particular economy and a goods flow into the economy. We get stuff from other nations when we import. We send our money out to pay for that stuff. So you can have a net export number that is negative. Now, this happens a lot in the United States. Is that a bad thing? No. Are we in a trade deficit frequently? Yes. That simply means that our currency continues to appreciate and that it is cheaper for us to purchase other goods and services from outside of the United States because we have a strong dollar. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Consumption. This is what consumers spend money on. They spend money on durable goods, non-durable goods, services, and consumer spending is the largest component of the U.S. gross domestic product. That should probably come as no surprise. Durable goods are usually goods that are thought to last for 3 or more years. Non-durable goods are considered to have a lifespan of less than 3 years, and services have a wide range. But anytime you get something out of paying for a service, that's considered a service that's added to GDP. College is a service because you go to class and they give you an education, or they help you become educated, whichever way you prefer to see it. Clothes, this is one that people always question. Some people can make clothes last for a very long time. Other people, they like to get new clothes more frequently than once every 3 to 5 years, which makes them non-durable goods. Because of fashion trends, personal preference, the material for clothes does not always last for a long period of time, or they are like my son and they can wear pants for about 2 weeks and then there are holes, mostly in the knees, but I digress. Gross private investment is spending that is in order to increase future output or productivity. So this is where you see a lot of businesses that are adding to capital, which could include human capital through education, training, development, professional enhancement. It could be machinery, physical capital, equipment that's used, or even new construction, where you're adding another Target store or Walmart or whatever the corporation or business may be. When they add to it, that is also investing in the expansion of their business. And then you have a change in unsold inventories. Unsold inventories count negatively against the gross private investment of businesses because the whole reason they allocated some of their scarce resources was to sell those products and get a profit. When those products sit on their shelf and go nowhere, it is actually costing that particular company money because they cannot invest in other goods and services that they could offer to their consumers or customers. It might actually be more profitable for them. Government spending is all levels of government spending, municipal, state, national, that are final goods and services and even infrastructure. So all of that construction on I-35, that if you traveled anywhere over spring break, I'm sure you saw lots of construction at different places on I-35. That all counts toward GDP. Transfer payments do not count toward GDP. So if you know anyone that collects Social Security, Disability, Medicare, Medicaid, Temporary Assistance for Needy Family, or any other sort of entitlement program for which you must qualify, those are not services that are provided. The government transfers money, literally, that's why they're called transfer payments. People and corporations, businesses that pay taxes, the government then takes the money that they earn through tax revenue and they transfer it to people who have demonstrated some sort of financial need. Net exports, you have exports minus imports. That's the formula that you would use. Exports create a flow of money to the United States in exchange for domestic production, the things that we make in the U.S. Imports create a flow of money away from the U.S. in exchange for foreign production from whatever nation we opt to purchase these goods and services from. Aggregate income. So there are 2 ways to calculate GDP. The aggregate spending, or the expenditure approach that I just discussed, to C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub N. That's the expenditure approach to GDP. That one is very, very frequently used, and you should know that one very well. You have to be able to calculate aggregate income, though. GDP measures spending and income. Income comes from those factor payments we talked about in one of the very first days of economics. So we talked about how you have land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurs. Landowners get rent, workers get wages for labor, capital, interest payments for capital. So lenders get interest and entrepreneurs get profit. It's payment for entrepreneurship. There are two sort of types of GDP. There's nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is the current GDP measured in current dollar prices, or whatever currency you happen to be dealing with. So the prices for 2015 are very different, and the purchasing power of a dollar in 2015 is very different than the purchasing power of a dollar in 1950. For example, in, I believe it was like 1965, the average household 3-bedroom, 2-bath house cost around $7,500, whereas the average 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the United States today is a little over $100,000. So when we wanted to compare the size of our economy or the size of our gross domestic output, we would have to have a base year. We'd have to adjust the price levels and compare them in $1950 or $2015. It doesn't matter which, but you have to compare them in the same price level, or you might as well be comparing apples and oranges. So nominal GDP, for that reason, could overstate the value of production because of inflationary pressures. Real GDP is the current GDP measured with a fixed dollar amount. So you select a base year and you convert all of the GDPs from each individual year which you would like to compare into that base year dollars, and then you have an appropriate method for comparing these two. Real GDP holds the value of the dollar constant and is useful for making year-to-year comparisons. Real GDP is the important one. I'll repeat that where you can actually see the words down at the bottom. My apologies. Real GDP is the important GDP to consider. So we have changes in GDP, and these are very important because they serve as changes in gross domestic product among some of the other topics we're going to cover in the next week and a half, like unemployment and inflation and the consumer price index, give us an idea of what is going on in our economy. We refer to them as economic indicators. So GDP shows us, it's a measure of a nation's prosperity and economic growth. The more we produce, the more services we provide, shows us that our economy is expanding and growing. And when our economy expands and grows, we go all the way back to that production possibilities frontier. And that would show us that our frontier actually expands and grows. So as GDP grows, the burden of scarcity becomes smaller for a society, because the more we produce, the more services we offer, the more wants and needs could possibly be satisfied. More people get to answer the questions, what to produce, how to produce, and for whom will those goods and services be produced. GDP per capita is a per person measure of the total output in an economy, and it provides a better measure of individual well-being than GDP overall. For example, if we have an $18 trillion GDP for 2015, because we're only in the first quarter, I should note there's absolutely no way to know what our GDP for 2015 will be, but let's pretend like we have an $18 trillion GDP for 2015. We divide that by, say, 320 million people living in the United States, and it's roughly 45-ish, because I'm rounding, $45,000 per person. That provides a very different standard of living than if we took the GDP of, say, China, which is a very densely populated nation, and I think the GDP of China the last time I looked was somewhere around 12 trillion, but then you divide that 12 trillion by 1.2 billion people, and you get a much smaller per capita GDP, which shows you that the standard of living per person is maybe not the same. The two, they're not the same.